welcome to the July episode of Fintech Firebrand. I'm Virginie O'Shea, founder of Firebrand Research, and I'm here to chat to you about all this month's FinReg and FinTech news. Now, given that I'm sitting in the UK, it's got quite warm here, but also in terms of FinReg, there's been a heating up of some of the reform processes that have been going on. Earlier in the year, the government put out some proposals about called the Edinburgh reforms, looking at trying to make the UK a more attractive place for investment and for fintech post-Brexit, desperately trying to get much more business back on the British shores. So this week, interestingly, the UK Chancellor gave a speech at Mansion House, which is customary every year to happen, during which he talked about some of the reforms that the government is planning. Now, we know that the Financial Conduct Authority, the FCA, has work to do to put some of these reforms into action. So it's not going to be immediate, but some of the proposals out there are interesting, winding back some of the EU regulation, which the UK was actually the architect of, interestingly enough. But one of those is talk about reforming MiFID with regards to things like research unbundling. So a winding back of those rules, so firms, instead of paying for research, would now have it bundled back again into packages. So it'll be interesting to see what the industry's feedback on that would be, given we've been living with unbundled research for quite some time now. I expect it will be a topic on FinReg Angle, the podcast I do with Global Custodian. Listen to that as well. But certainly there are many more reforms in the cards. Potentially, there's also talk about the digital pound as part of these reforms as well. So the central bank digital currency is, and the retail side is something else that the Chancellor talked about as well. So a lot to unpack from some of the discussions this week. Now, as usual in the US, there's been a lot of discussion about what to do post-SVB, Silicon Valley Bank, Signature Bank, all of the other banks that had some woes earlier this year. Federal Reserve Bank has been talking about how to address some of these issues. They are in charge, obviously, of monitoring the stability of banks, which is essential to the economy of the US. So one of the heads of the Fed, Barr, this week talked about introducing more reforms with regards to liquidity and capital. So that's big news for especially mid-tier banks of over $100 billion, I think, in reserves is what the discussion was. So extending from the GSIBs, the globally systemically important banks, down to the mid-tier or smaller banks as well, introducing more capital and liquidity requirements for those banks, which will put much more pressure from the fintech side on managing capital and liquidity for that tier of banking institutions. So expect there to be knock-on effects over time with regards to risk management, capital management, liquidity management, collateral management. You name it, there's going to be pressures there. So will be interesting to see, the root of the reforms. The Fed's been talking about this for a while. So the Board of Governors are putting pressure on regulators across the land to look at this kind of thing, make sure that the industry is well prepared for another significant crisis, well capitalized enough to ride through any market turbulence. So again, big news for the fintech crowd in the long term too. Another interesting development, this also in the US, it has been dubbed ESG month, July, with the politicians out there, especially those, interestingly, in the anti-ESG camp. There's a big push by the House Financial Services Committee's Republican members. They have their own ESG working group that was set up sometime last year. They've put together a report. They put it out at the end of June. There's going to be a lot of key discussions this month about how to push those reforms forward. Interestingly, one of the reforms is looking at the G of ESG, and in fact would bolster governance processes for the fund space. So currently proxy voting goes on for single name equities in the market, but doesn't tend to happen for fund vehicles. Now the proposals, which I think originally were in the Index Act a couple of years ago, are now being sort of pushed more formally with a wider package of reforms by the Republicans. are targeted at introducing more pass-through voting. So fund holders actually being able to vote on the underlying shares of the companies that they have in those underlying shares. So certainly the notion is from the anti-ESG camp that this would bring down any undue influence of asset managers that may have a green agenda. This may not actually result in changes that they expect, I would think, with regards to retail investors, but it certainly is an interesting development from the ESG side of things. Now, I can't do a roundup of FinReg without talking about what's going on the EU shores as well. We've seen a lot of proposals around retail shareholders over the last month or so. I think I've talked about it in one of these episodes before, but there's a big push for the Capital Markets Union around encouraging more retail investment. Now, this is something I'm actually working on research on. I'm looking at proxy voting and retail investment as well. It's interesting to see that there are such low levels in certain markets, less than 5% of retail of investment is related to retail investment. So in certain markets. So there's understandable why the EU is trying to push this and encourage cross-border investment as well, bringing down some of those barriers that Giovanni identified back in, I think, 2001, in fact, which is a long time ago. Interestingly, the retail shareholder stuff is not the only thing that ESMA is working on. As you can imagine, they're going to have another busy summer, frantically working down by the beach in the south coast of France. I'm sure there'll be a lot of working from beach going on. But certainly ESMA has been talking about a lot of other things. There's been a lot of discussion over recent months with regards to settlement efficiency. We're also having a big push around the costs related to the retail investors, but making sure that costs for funds are much lower. So at the moment, they are much higher than they are in markets such as the US, where retail trading is prevalent. So there's a big push to try and understand how to bring those costs down, trying to push the regulators at the national competent authorities at the EU level, all of the varied markets out there, to try and be on the same page as each other. Another interesting thing that ESMA has been doing is a mystery shopper exercise. Now, that's not just something that happens where people go in and test out various retail shops. It's also going on in the FinReg space. And what ESMA has been examining is to do with the national competent authorities' approaches to enforcement and actions across the board. So certainly that there was a report released on that earlier this month. I think the ESMA team found that there was a lot wanting from some of the competent authorities. I know that ESMA has powers to be able to compel national competent authorities to sort of march to the drum of what ESMA has been saying. So it'll be interesting to see if any further actions are taken in future. But certainly nice to see that there is a lot of investigation on the part of ESMA, even though they have a very full agenda from the FinReg drafting perspective, including the review of MiFID that's going on, the review of SRD2, and God knows what else on their docket. Now, I try and be as global as possible, so some news from LATAM and the Caribbean today as well, or this week, in terms of the UN's ESG standards or principles related to the Common Framework for Sustainable Finance taxonomies has been adopted officially by LATAM and the Caribbean. There's been a launch event this month, I believe it was yesterday, with regards to pushing that framework in those two jurisdictions. So certainly some progress on the ESG and the FinReg front with regards to a common taxonomy for the globe, it being truly global from the UN perspective. So great to see that. I know UNPRI have been working very hard over recent years on those topics. So great to see some progress in that region as well. And my final thoughts for the month in terms of things to look out for this year. Certainly we've got a lot on the docket over the summer period. I know that some people are taking holidays, but certainly on the research front, we're doing a lot of work looking at the tokenization process. Now, it's interesting to note, the amount of POCs and pilots out there with regards to funds tokenization or tokenization of more traditional assets, bonds as well. Very interesting to see that. Some of the learnings that we've noticed from some of our research is that there's a lot lacking in terms of the sort of support framework for tokenized assets. So obviously, I probably mentioned this before, there's no central bank digital currency on the wholesale side to facilitate the payments leg of those transactions, which makes things challenging. That means a lot of manual work on the part of financial institutions trying to do these pilots. We're also seeing some challenges with regards to know your client or KYC processes. We don't yet have any sort of standards for digital identification either. It could be challenging in certain markets. We don't have very much in the way of digital identification in the UK, for example. We have passports, but that's it. We don't have identity cards and numbers that EU citizens may have. So there are a lot of sort of outstanding questions with regards to tokenization, but it's certainly a very interesting thing to look at. And I would say globally, we're seeing a lot of interesting pilots at certain hotspots in Europe. For example, France has been very active. We've seen a lot of activity in Italy as well on the tokenization front. Some are slightly more cautious. Obviously, Switzerland has been very active, and the UK is sort of moving gradually down that route. Certainly a lot of investigation, and CBDCs are being discussed by many central banks. Whether they go anywhere is another matter, but we do need on that front, if we are moving to a tokenized platform, if we've got sort of multiple blockchains, they also need to be interoperable. Goodness, never easy to say. With regards to that, I know that Swift is working on trying to focus on standards in that area. So some very interesting things ahead of Sibos this year that will be discussed, no doubt, on stage.